The trading station floated in the darkness of space like a small city made of metal and glass. Thousands of different alien species walked through its long corridors doing business and making deals. Some were tall and some were short and some looked almost human, while others looked like nothing anyone from Earth had ever imagined. The station orbited around an old dying star that glowed with a dim orange light, and ships came and went from the docking bays at all hours bringing cargo and passengers from every corner of the galaxy. Daniel Brooks stood near a large window looking out at the endless stars. He was a lieutenant in the Earth Colonial Navy, and he wore his uniform with quiet pride. His brown hair was cut short in military fashion, and his blue eyes moved constantly, watching everything around him. 3 months had passed since he arrived at this station on a diplomatic assignment, and he still found himself amazed by the sheer variety of life in the universe. Back on Earth, he had studied xenobiology and alien cultures, but seeing them in person was completely different from reading about them in books and reports. He was watching a cargo ship dock when he heard a voice behind him. The voice was deep and powerful, like rocks grinding together in an earthquake. Daniel turned slowly and carefully, not wanting to appear startled or afraid. What he saw made his heart beat a little faster, even though he tried to stay calm. The creature standing before him was nearly 8 feet tall and covered from head to toe in black scales that seemed to drink in the light around them. Its eyes glowed with an amber color that reminded Daniel of burning coals, and when it opened its mouth he could see rows of sharp crystalline teeth that caught the artificial light of the station. The creature had powerful arms ending in clawed hands, and its body moved with the grace of a born hunter. Daniel recognized it immediately from his training materials. This was a Cravathi, and the Cravathi were known throughout the galaxy as the most dangerous predators in known space. The Cravathi had conquered 17 star systems before the Galactic Council managed to negotiate a peace treaty with them. They came from a death world where everything wanted to kill everything else and only the strongest and smartest survived. Their entire culture was built around hunting and combat and proving strength through action, rather than words. Most species in the galaxy gave the Cravathi a wide berth and avoided them whenever possible, because picking a fight with one was considered a form of suicide. Daniel straightened his posture and met the creature's glowing eyes without looking away. He had been taught that showing fear to a predator species was the worst possible response. He extended his right hand in the human gesture of greeting, even though he had no idea if the Cravathi would understand or appreciate it. The alien stared at Daniel's outstretched hand for several long seconds. Then it spoke again in that deep, grinding voice. Its name was Vexthor, and it was a prime hunter of the 7th Fleet, which Daniel understood to be a very high rank in Cravathi society. Vexthor said he knew what humans were, and he called them soft and weak and new to the stars. His tone was not exactly insulting, but it was not friendly either. It was the tone of someone stating what they believed to be obvious facts. Daniel slowly lowered his hand, but he did not step backward or break eye contact. He admitted that humans were indeed new to galactic society, but he disagreed about being weak. There was a difference between being new and being helpless, and Daniel wanted to make sure this Cravathi understood that difference. A rumbling sound came from Vexthor's chest, and Daniel realized after a moment that it might be laughter. The Cravathi pointed out that Earth had no natural predators that could challenge adult humans anymore. Humans had no claws or fangs or venom or armor, or any of the natural weapons that marked a true predator species. Human teeth were mostly flat for grinding plant matter, and human nails were blunt and useless for combat. Yet somehow, humans had survived long enough to develop space travel and join the galactic community. Vexthor wanted to know how such a weak species had managed this feat. Daniel's answer was simple and direct. Humans had learned to make their own weapons and tools, and they had learned to work together in groups. What they lacked in natural weapons, they made up for with intelligence and cooperation. A single human might be weak, but humans rarely fought alone. Vexthor dismissed this with a wave of his clawed hand. He said the galaxy respected only strength and power, and everything else was just empty words. He told Daniel that he had heard rumors about humanity. Other species whispered that humans were different somehow. They said humans did not know when to quit or when to surrender. They said humans were stubborn and relentless and refused to accept defeat even when defeat was inevitable. Vexthor wanted to see for himself if any of these rumors were true, or if they were just exaggerations and myths. Daniel asked what kind of test the Cravathi had in mind, and he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Vexthor confirmed his suspicion immediately. The Cravathi wanted to go on a hunt together down in the lower levels of the station. Those levels had been abandoned years ago, and over time, various dangerous creatures had escaped from cargo holds and made their homes in the darkness. Station security considered the lower levels too dangerous to patrol regularly. Vexthor proposed that he and Daniel hunt these creatures together, and through this hunt he would see what humans were truly made of. Every instinct Daniel possessed told him this was a terrible idea. The lower levels were restricted for very good reasons. People who went down there sometimes did not come back. But Daniel also understood what was really happening here. This was not just about hunting dangerous animals. This was about humanity's reputation in a galaxy where physical strength seemed to matter more than anything else. If he refused, he would be confirming every negative stereotype about humans being weak and cowardly. If he accepted, he might die, but at least he would die proving that humans had courage. Daniel made his decision quickly. He asked when they would start the hunt, and Vexthor's glowing eyes seemed to brighten with something that might have been approval, or anticipation, or both. The Cravathi's answer was immediate and final. They would start now. There would be no time to prepare or plan or think about backing out. The hunt would begin immediately, and Daniel would have to trust his instincts and his training to keep him alive in the darkness below. The lower levels of the station were like a completely different world from the busy trading floors above. The corridors here were dark and narrow, and the air smelled stale and old. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of deep red that made shadows seem to move and crawl along the walls. The life support systems down here barely functioned, and Daniel could hear strange creaking and groaning sounds as the old metal structure shifted and settled. Water dripped from somewhere in the darkness, and the temperature was noticeably colder than the upper levels. Daniel had stopped by the station security office before descending, and they had given him a standard plasma pistol with 2 extra power cells. The weapon felt solid and reassuring in his hand, even though he hoped he would not need to use it. Vexthor carried no weapons at all except for what looked like a ceremonial blade strapped across his back. The Cravathi moved through the darkness with absolute confidence, relying on his natural weapons of claws and teeth, and his superior senses to guide him. As they walked deeper into the abandoned sections, Vexthor made a comment about human reliance on tools and weapons. He said this dependence made humans weak because they could not survive without their technology. Daniel disagreed politely but firmly. He explained that tools were what made humans strong in the first place. Evolution had given the Cravathi claws and scales and natural armor, but evolution had given humans intelligence and opposable thumbs, and the ability to create and use tools. Both were valid survival strategies, and neither was inherently superior to the other. They had been moving through the darkness for nearly an hour when they found the first real signs that something dangerous lived down here. Deep claw marks gouged into the metal walls showed where something large and powerful had sharpened its natural weapons. The marks were fresh enough that flakes of metal still lay on the floor beneath them. There was also a smell in the air that made Daniel's eyes water and his nose burn. It was a sharp, acrid scent like chemicals mixed with rotting meat. Vexthor stopped and inhaled deeply through his nostrils. His whole body tensed like a coiled spring ready to release. He identified the creatures they were tracking as razorbacks and estimated there were 6 or 7 of them nearby. Daniel asked what razorbacks were exactly, and Vexthor explained they were pack-hunting quadrupeds from Sector 9 of the galaxy. They were highly aggressive and attacked anything that entered their territory. They had acidic saliva that could burn through most materials, and their bodies were covered in sharp, bony ridges that made them difficult to grab or hold. Even Cravathi warriors considered them dangerous opponents. The attack happened so suddenly that Daniel barely had time to react. The razorbacks burst from a side corridor, moving with terrifying speed on their 4 legs. In the red emergency lighting, they looked like nightmares made flesh. Their bodies were roughly the size of large dogs from Earth, but they were covered in bony protrusions that stuck out at odd angles. Their mouths were open and dripping with luminescent green fluid that hissed and smoked when it hit the metal floor. Their eyes reflected the dim light with an unholy yellow glow. Vexthor moved faster than Daniel would have thought possible for something so large. His claws extended and he met the first razorback head-on, tearing through its body with brutal efficiency. Dark blood sprayed across the corridor and the creature's dying scream echoed off the metal walls. Daniel raised his plasma pistol and fired 3 quick shots in succession. The bright blue bolts of Superheated plasma caught two of the Razorbacks in mid-leap and sent them crashing to the ground, where they twitched and went still. But there were more creatures coming from the darkness, and they seemed to be everywhere at once. Daniel pressed his back against the wall and continued firing in controlled bursts, trying to conserve his weapon's energy. Each shot had to count, because once the power cell was depleted, he would need precious seconds to reload. Vexthor was a blur of motion, his black scales making him almost invisible in the shadows except when his claws caught the light. The Cravathi was magnificent in combat, moving with a grace and power that spoke of millions of years of evolution as an apex predator. But even Vexthor was beginning to show signs of strain. There were simply too many Razorbacks, and they kept coming in waves. One of the creatures managed to get past his defenses and raked its claws across his left arm, drawing dark purple blood that looked black in the red lighting. Vexthor roared in pain and anger and crushed the creature's skull with his bare hands, but Daniel could see the wound was serious. That was when Daniel noticed something important about how the Razorbacks were attacking. They were not just rushing in blindly like mindless beasts. They were using tactics and strategy. They were trying to separate Daniel and Vexthor and isolate them from each other. It was classic pack hunting behavior that Daniel recognized from studying earth wolves and other social predators. The Razorbacks wanted to divide their prey and then overwhelm each target individually. Daniel shouted for Vexthor to come to his position and stand back to back with him. The Cravathi hesitated for only a brief moment, clearly surprised by the command. But then understanding showed in his glowing amber eyes, and he quickly moved to Daniel's side. They stood back to back, creating a defensive position that covered all angles and eliminated the Razorback's ability to attack from behind. Daniel explained quickly between weapon shots that the Razorbacks were herding animals, trying to separate and isolate their prey. By standing together and protecting each other's backs, they removed that tactical advantage. Vexthor understood immediately and adjusted his fighting style to complement Daniel's. When Daniel needed to reload his weapon, Vexthor covered that side with his claws. When Vexthor struck at a target, Daniel provided covering fire to protect his exposed flanks. They fought together with a coordination that surprised both of them. Despite coming from completely different worlds and having completely different biology, they fell into a rhythm that worked. Daniel's weapon covered the angles that Vexthor's claws could not reach effectively. Vexthor's raw physical power protected Daniel during the vulnerable moments when his plasma pistol needed to recharge. Within a matter of minutes, the remaining Razorbacks seemed to realize they were facing opponents who would not be easily defeated. The creatures retreated back into the darkness, making strange whistling sounds that might have been communication with others of their kind. Vexthor examined the wound on his arm and then turned to look at Daniel with an expression that might have been respect. He said that Daniel saw patterns and thought like a hunter, even though humans were supposedly prey animals. Daniel explained that humans had been prey once, a very long time ago in their evolutionary history. But they had learned to think like the predators that hunted them. They learned to predict behavior and plan ahead and adapt to changing situations. That was how humanity had survived and eventually thrived on Earth. Vexthor said this was interesting and suggested they continue deeper into the lower levels. The hunt was not finished yet, and there were more dangerous things waiting in the darkness ahead. They moved deeper into the abandoned sections of the station, following trails of destruction that spoke of something much larger and more dangerous than the Razorbacks they had already encountered. The corridors here were even older than the previous levels, and some of them looked like they had been built when the station was first constructed hundreds of years ago. The walls were covered in writing that Daniel could not read even with his translator device. These were languages that had died out generations ago, and the metal itself was pitted and scarred with age and neglect. Daniel's communicator suddenly crackled to life with static, and then a voice came through asking for his status. It was Station Command checking on his biosigns because their sensors showed he was deep in a restricted area. Daniel confirmed that his status was good and that he was conducting authorized activity. The voice on the other end acknowledged his response, but then added a warning that made Daniel's blood run cold. There had been multiple reports over the past few weeks of a large unidentified creature in Section 7. Station Command strongly recommended immediate evacuation of that area. Daniel looked at Vexthor and informed him that Section 7 was exactly where they were headed based on the trail they were following. The Cravathi observed that Daniel's command structure wanted him to flee from danger. Daniel corrected him and explained that they wanted him to be careful and that there was an important difference between caution and cowardice. Vexthor made that rumbling sound again that might have been laughter or approval. They found the creature in what had once been a massive cargo bay. The space was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness high above them. Old shipping containers were stacked haphazardly throughout the bay, creating a maze of metal corridors and dead ends. And in the center of this maze stood something that made even Vexthor pause and take a step backward. The creature was easily 15 feet tall when it stood on its hind legs. It had 6 limbs that ended in claws as long as Daniel's forearm. Its hide looked like living stone, with plates of gray armor covering every inch of its massive body. The creature's eyes were milky white and clearly blind, but its head moved back and forth as if it could sense their presence through some other means. When it opened its mouth, Daniel could see rows of teeth that looked like they could bite through solid steel without any effort. Vexthor breathed the creature's name with something close to fear in his voice. It was a dreadmaw, and he said he had only seen one once before in his entire life. That encounter had cost the lives of 12 of his finest warriors, before they had finally managed to bring the creature down through sheer numbers and determination. Dreadmaws were apex predators from a world where gravity was twice as strong as Earth. Normal and everything had evolved to be nearly indestructible. The dreadmaw turned its blind eyes toward them and somehow seemed to know exactly where they were standing. It opened its mouth and released a roar that shook dust from the ceiling and made Daniel's bones vibrate inside his body. The sound was so loud and so deep that it felt like being hit with a physical force. Daniel said they needed to leave immediately, because they were not equipped to fight something like this. His plasma pistol would barely scratch that armored hide, and Vexthor's claws would not do much better against stone-like plates. This was not a fight they could win through conventional means. Vexthor stated firmly that a prime hunter did not flee from any challenge and raised his claws ready to charge the massive creature. Daniel grabbed Vexthor's arm and told him there was a difference between bravery and suicide. They needed to look at the situation logically and find a weakness they could exploit. Rushing in blindly would just get them both killed and accomplish nothing. Vexthor demanded to know what Daniel suggested if he was so smart. Daniel's mind raced as he took in every detail of their surroundings. He looked at the cargo bay with its high ceiling and the massive loading doors on the far wall. He noticed the control panel near those doors that would open them to the vacuum of space. He studied the dreadmaw's milky white eyes and the way its head moved, tracking sounds and vibrations. A plan began forming in his mind, and it was risky, but it might be their only chance. He told Vexthor that the creature hunted by sound and vibration because it was adapted for complete darkness. Its blindness was actually an advantage in environments where sight was useless. But that adaptation was also a potential weakness they could exploit. Daniel explained quickly that they could use the cargo bay loading doors to flush the creature into space, but it would require perfect timing and absolute trust between them. Vexthor asked what Daniel had in mind, and Daniel outlined his plan. Vexthor would draw the dreadmaw's attention using noise to keep it focused, while Daniel made his way around the edge of the bay to reach the control panel. Once Daniel was in position, Vexthor would lead the creature directly in front of the loading doors. Then Daniel would open those doors, and the vacuum of space would suck the dreadmaw out into the void where it could not survive. The Cravathi pointed out immediately that this plan was extremely dangerous. If Daniel opened the doors even 1 second too early, Vexthor would be pulled into space along with the creature. If Vexthor could not move fast enough to get clear, he would die. There were dozens of ways the plan could fail, and most of them ended with one or both of them dead. This plan required perfect timing and perfect execution, and most importantly, it required them to trust each other completely. Daniel met Vexthor's glowing amber eyes and asked if the Cravathi was willing to trust a human with his life. Vexthor stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel could see the internal struggle happening behind those alien eyes. Everything in Cravathi culture was built on individual strength and self-reliance. Trusting someone else completely went against every instinct the warrior possessed. But finally Vexthor nodded once and told Daniel to begin. Vexthor moved out into the open cargo bay and began making noise by striking his claws against the metal floor in a rhythmic pattern. The dreadmaw's head snapped toward the sound immediately, and the massive creature began moving in that direction with surprising speed. Vexthor led it forward step by step, keeping just out of reach of those enormous claws. Daniel used the distraction to sprint along the wall of the cargo bay, staying low and quiet. He moved from shadow to shadow using the stacked containers for cover. His heart pounded in his chest and sweat ran down his face despite the cold air. Everything depended on him reaching that control panel and being ready at exactly the right moment. The control panel was ancient and covered in dust. The interface was written in 3 different languages, and Daniel's translator struggled with the older text. He found what he thought were the door controls, and his hand hovered over the activation switch. Now all he could do was wait for Vexthor to get the creature into position and pray that his timing would be perfect. Vexthor moved through the cargo bay like a dancer performing an ancient and deadly routine. He struck the metal floor with his claws, creating sharp ringing sounds that echoed through the vast space. He banged against containers and walls, making as much noise as possible to keep the Dreadmaw's attention focused entirely on him. The massive creature followed the sounds with single-minded determination, turning its blind eyes toward each new noise and moving forward with terrifying speed. Daniel watched from his position at the control panel, with his finger hovering over the door activation switch. He had to time this perfectly. Too early and Vexthor would be sucked into space along with the Dreadmaw. Too late and the creature might turn away, or Vexthor might run out of room to maneuver. Daniel's entire body was tense with concentration, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Vexthor was doing his part perfectly and leading the Dreadmaw exactly where it needed to go. He moved with grace and precision, keeping just ahead of those massive claws. Each step was calculated and each noise was timed to draw the creature forward. Daniel felt a surge of respect for the Cravathi warrior who was putting his life in the hands of a human he had only met hours ago. Then everything went wrong in an instant. The Dreadmaw was faster than either of them had anticipated. One of its 6 limbs swept out in a wide arc that Vexthor did not see coming. The blow caught the Cravathi directly across his chest and sent him flying through the air like a toy. Vexthor crashed into a support pillar with tremendous force and crumpled to the ground, stunned and unable to move. He lay there directly in the path of the advancing Dreadmaw, which had already turned toward the sound of impact. Daniel did not think about what he did next. There was no time for planning or weighing options or considering consequences. He simply acted on pure instinct. He raised his plasma pistol and fired every remaining shot he had directly at the Dreadmaw's head. The bright blue bolts splashed harmlessly off the creature's stone-like armor, but they made noise. They made lots and lots of noise. The Dreadmaw's attention shifted instantly away from the fallen Vexthor. Those milky white eyes turned toward Daniel, and the massive creature began moving in his direction with frightening speed. Daniel knew his weapon was now completely empty and useless, but he did not care. He had accomplished what he needed to accomplish, which was to draw the creature away from his injured companion. Daniel abandoned his safe position at the control panel and ran out into the open cargo bay. He did not run away from the Dreadmaw, but toward it, leading the creature past where Vexthor lay. Daniel shouted at the top of his lungs and banged his empty pistol against every surface he passed. He made himself as loud and obvious as possible, giving the Dreadmaw no choice but to follow him instead of finishing off the wounded Cravathi. His lungs burned with effort, and his legs felt like they were on fire. His heart hammered so hard in his chest he thought it might burst. But he kept running and kept making noise and kept the Dreadmaw focused on him. He was leading it exactly where it needed to be positioned in front of those massive loading doors. Vexthor struggled to his feet, fighting through the pain and confusion. It took him only seconds to understand what Daniel had done. The human had given up his safe position at the controls and had sacrificed every tactical advantage to save him. Daniel had put himself in direct danger to protect a Cravathi warrior he barely knew. This went against everything Vexthor understood about survival and self-preservation. No predator would ever do such a thing for another predator. With a roar that combined pain and fury and determination, Vexthor launched himself at the Dreadmaw from behind. His claws found the joints between the creature's armor plates where the stone-like hide was thinner and more vulnerable. These were weak points that few beings knew existed and even fewer could reach. Vexthor drove his claws deep into those joints and the Dreadmaw bellowed in surprise and rage. The massive creature spun around, confused by attacks coming from 2 different directions. It could track sound and vibration, but when those signals came from multiple sources at once, its hunting instincts became overwhelmed. The Dreadmaw thrashed wildly, trying to eliminate both threats at the same time. Daniel saw his opportunity and shouted for Vexthor to get clear. He sprinted back toward the control panel with the last reserves of his energy. His fingers found the activation switch and he slammed it down without hesitation. The cargo bay loading doors began to open with a mechanical groan that seemed to take forever. At first nothing happened, but then Daniel felt a gentle breeze as air began flowing toward the opening. The breeze quickly became a wind, and the wind became a hurricane of force. Everything that was not bolted down started sliding across the floor toward the opening doors. Small debris and dust swirled through the air, creating a blinding cloud. The sound was deafening as atmosphere rushed out into the vacuum of space with the roar of an angry god. The Dreadmaw felt the change in pressure and turned its blind eyes toward the opening. It tried to dig its claws into the metal floor to anchor itself, but the force pulling it toward space was too strong. The creature's massive body began sliding backward inch by inch. It roared in fury and confusion as it lost its battle with physics. The Dreadmaw's claws left deep gouges in the floor as it was dragged toward its doom. With one final roar of rage, the creature vanished through the opening and disappeared into the void. Vexthor had already grabbed hold of a support pillar, wrapping both arms around it as the decompression tried to claim him. The wind tore at his body and he could feel his grip weakening. His injured arm was losing strength fast and he knew he could not hold on much longer. Just a few more seconds was all he needed, but those seconds felt like hours. Daniel hit the emergency close button with all his remaining strength. The massive loading doors reversed direction and began grinding shut again. The hurricane force wind slowly decreased as the opening grew smaller. Finally, the doors sealed completely and the cargo bay fell silent, except for the sound of two beings breathing heavily. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood there alive against all odds and probability. Daniel's legs finally gave out and he collapsed to his knees from exhaustion. Vexthor released his grip on the support pillar and stumbled forward a few steps before catching his balance. The Cravati spoke first, and his voice carried a weight that Daniel had not heard before. Vexthor said that Daniel had abandoned his position of safety to protect him. Daniel had given up every advantage to save a Cravathi warrior he had no obligation to help. Daniel looked up at the towering alien and replied simply that they were hunting partners, and that was what hunting partners did for each other. Vexthor shook his head slowly and said that was not what predators did. Predators were solitary creatures who protected only themselves and their own interests. What Daniel had done was something completely different and something Vexthor did not fully understand. But he knew it was important, and it had shaken everything he believed about strength and survival. They made their way back to the upper levels of the station in complete silence. Neither of them spoke as they climbed through access shafts and navigated the maze of abandoned corridors. Both were covered in injuries and the blood of various creatures they had fought. Daniel's uniform was torn in several places and Vexithor's scales were cracked and bleeding in spots. But they were alive, and that was what mattered most. Station security was waiting for them at the checkpoint that separated the restricted lower levels from the active upper sections. The security officers stared in shock at the condition of both Daniel and Vexthor. They immediately called for medical teams to come and treat their injuries. Several doctors arrived within minutes carrying medical equipment and scanning devices. They tried to examine both the human and the Cravathi, but Vexthor waved them away with a growl. He told them he did not need their help and his wounds would heal on their own. Vexthor turned to Daniel and said they needed to speak privately about what had happened in the lower levels. His tone was serious and formal in a way it had not been before. Daniel agreed, and they found an empty observation deck that overlooked the docking bays. Through the transparent walls, they could see stars wheeling slowly in the endless void of space. Ships came and went like fireflies dancing in the darkness, completely unaware of the drama that had unfolded below. Vexthor stood at the window for a long time before speaking. He finally said that he had come to the station specifically to test Daniel and to test humanity. He had heard rumors from other species about how humans were different from other races in the galaxy. He had expected to find weakness disguised as confidence. He had expected to find a species that had survived through luck, rather than through any real strength or ability. He had been completely wrong. Daniel asked what Vexthor had found instead. The Cravathi turned away from the stars to face Daniel directly. He said he had found something that frightened him more than any Dreadmaw or any other creature in the galaxy. He had found a species that did not follow the normal rules of survival and evolution. He had found something completely unexpected and deeply troubling. Vexthor explained that when Daniel had left the control panel to save him, It had been the wrong decision from a logical standpoint. Daniel should have stayed at the controls where he was safe and let the Dreadmaw finish off the wounded Cravathi. That would have been the smart choice and the practical choice, but Daniel had not made the logical choice. He had abandoned safety and advantage to protect someone who was essentially a stranger. Daniel tried to explain that humans were social creatures who had evolved to live and work in groups. Human strength had always come from cooperation and trust and the willingness to help each other, even at personal cost. It was not weakness, but rather a different kind of strength. Humans had learned millions of years ago that they were stronger together than they were alone. Vexthor said that on his homeworld, the strong survived alone, and the weak died. Cravathi competed with their own kind almost as fiercely as they fought their enemies. If a Cravathi warrior fell in battle, other warriors would step over the body without a second thought. They would call it natural selection and the way of nature. But humans seemed to operate under completely different rules. Humans bound themselves together with invisible threads of loyalty and trust. They made themselves vulnerable in order to protect each other. Daniel asked why that frightened Vexthor so much. The Cravathi was quiet for a moment before answering. He said he was beginning to understand why the galaxy whispered nervously about humanity. Humans were not the strongest species or the fastest or the most physically dangerous. They had no natural weapons or armor or adaptations that marked them as predators. Yet they might be the most dangerous species in all of known space for reasons that had nothing to do with physical strength. Vexthor explained his reasoning carefully. A single Cravathi warrior was formidable and dangerous and could defeat most opponents in single combat. But a Cravathi warrior ultimately fought alone even when surrounded by others of his kind. A human warrior was different. A human warrior fought with the strength of every other human who had ever lived. Humans carried their history and their dead with them into every battle. They fought not just for themselves but for their companions and their families and their entire species. When one human fell, 10 more would take their place bound by nothing more than memory and shared purpose. The Cravathi said that humans were individually weak, but collectively, they were unstoppable. That was terrifying because it meant humanity operated under rules that the rest of the galaxy did not understand. Most species saw cooperation as a temporary alliance of convenience. Humans saw cooperation as their fundamental nature and their greatest strength. They did not just work together when necessary. They seemed incapable of not working together. Then Vexthor did something that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. Slowly and deliberately, the massive Cravathi warrior lowered himself to one knee before Daniel. His head bowed and his claws spread flat on the floor in a gesture of submission and respect. Daniel was too shocked to speak for several seconds. He finally found his voice and asked what Vexthor was doing. The Cravathi explained that among his people they knelt only before those who had proven themselves superior in combat. But today he had learned there was more than one kind of strength in the universe. Daniel had saved his life when the logical choice would have been to save himself. Daniel had trusted Vexthor to do his part when any reasonable being would have doubted. In doing so, Daniel had demonstrated that humanity's true strength was not in weapons or tools, but in their absolute refusal to abandon each other, even at the cost of personal safety. Vexthor said he had come to the station, believing he was the galaxy's strongest predator and the ultimate warrior, but now he understood something fundamental. An apex predator fought alone and knew only competition and dominance. Humans had evolved beyond that limited way of thinking. Humans had learned to transform enemies into allies, and to build strength from cooperation rather than from domination. That was not the behavior of predators. That was the behavior of something far more dangerous than any predator could ever be. Daniel asked what that was. Vexthor looked up at him with those glowing amber eyes and said it was the behavior of true survivors. Not creatures that merely endured hardship, but creatures that thrived and adapted and changed the fundamental rules of existence itself. The galaxy had known many predators over millions of years, but it had never encountered a species quite like humanity. Humans did not conquer through superior strength. They conquered through unity and cooperation and the unshakable belief that they were stronger together than... Apart, Vexthor rose to his feet, and this time when Daniel extended his hand, the Cravathi took it without hesitation. Their hands clasped in a gesture of mutual respect that crossed the boundaries of species and culture. Daniel said that humans did not want to conquer anyone. They simply wanted to survive and to help others survive as well, all of them together sharing the galaxy in peace. Vexthor said quietly that perhaps the galaxy was about to learn something new and revolutionary. Perhaps it would learn that the strongest force in the universe was not sharp claws or thick armor, or superior firepower. Perhaps the strongest force was simply the willingness to stand beside your companions when logic said to run away. If that was true, then humanity's rise was inevitable and unstoppable. Every species would need to decide whether they stood with humanity or whether they would be left behind by evolution itself. They stood together at the observation window looking out at the stars. Somewhere in that vast darkness, the galaxy continued its ancient patterns of predator and prey and strong versus weak. But something had changed in that ancient equation. Something new had entered the cosmic stage. Not a stronger predator or a fiercer warrior, but something infinitely more powerful. A species that refused to fight alone. A species that transformed strangers into family and enemies into friends. A species that found strength not in isolation, but in unity and cooperation. 3 months passed before Daniel received a message from Vexthor. The Cravathi had returned to his home fleet and had apparently told his people everything he had learned. The message was brief but carried tremendous weight. Vexthor wrote that some Cravathi called him weak for kneeling before a human, but many more were curious and wanted to understand this strange power that humans possessed. This ability to bind individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts. Perhaps in time the Cravathi could learn from humanity. Perhaps they too could evolve beyond being simple predators. Vexthor thanked Daniel for teaching him that strength came not from standing alone, but from refusing to let others stand alone. He hoped they would hunt together again someday as friends. Daniel smiled as he read the message and looked out at the stars once more. Maybe humanity's greatest gift to the galaxy would not be technology or weapons or territorial expansion. Maybe it would be something simpler and more profound. The idea that true strength came from unity rather than isolation. That the real apex predator was not the one who conquered all others, but the one who convinced all others to stop fighting and stand together instead. Perhaps that was exact